Well, howdy, friends, and welcome to episode 14 of the Roundup Podcast. I am your host, Mitch Tidwell, and I have with me my co-host, Kylie Badgley. Kylie, how are you?
I'm doing good. It's Friday when we're recording this, so that's good.
It is Friday. Well, hey, we are talking about the book, College Ministry in a Post-Christian Culture, and so this book has meant so much to me. It was one of the first books I read, jumping into college ministry, and has really shaped the way I philosophically and practically think about college ministry. So we got the author, Steve Lutz, on the podcast and just pegged him with questions about how this book was birthed and why he wrote it and what are kind of the practical how-tos of thinking about ministry in this way. Because really what the burden was that, and I don't want to give too much because Steve gets into this a little bit, but is why he wrote it. And a lot of that was birthed in the fact that the college ministry is constantly changing and we have to be married to our principles, but fairly adaptive in our methods. So just really, really good stuff.
Yeah, it was really good, and it was cool because I hear a lot of the same language, like at work here and at church, and just different things. So it's cool to be able to get the person who really wrote a whole book about that stuff to get his perspective and get to ask him more specific questions of like, okay, cool, but what does that look like? Or how do I actually do that? So that was really cool. So also he kept saying a couple of times, he was talking about how the world is now, like his book says a post-Christian culture, and he kept referring to past things and saying seeker-sensitive movement, I think. So I had never heard that. So in case there's anyone else who is young like me or, new to ministry, church world, can you tell us what that means?
So that actually makes me feel pretty old. So he does. So he writes this book out of, as right now the big talk was millennials, and now we're getting into Generation Z, and we're kind of transitioning. When he wrote this book, which is actually almost 10 years ago, that was the talk of going from Generation X to millennials, and so that was what really caused that shift. Well, during that time, there was a shift in the philosophy of church ministry from seeker-sensitive to these other kind of forms that he even talks about in the podcast. But the seeker-sensitive movement was this type of movement happening in church over the 80s and 90s, and perhaps even longer than that, where churches were basically mobilize their people to invite the church. And you saw as they would start up all these different ministries that were very kind of niche to different people. And what we saw was the church grow very rapidly and get very big. And I think one of the things that some people may argue is that the church grew big as far as wide, but didn't grow deep in its depth. And so I think that some of those, when you think seeker-sensitive, that's kind of what that is talking about. So hopefully that helps. Yeah. I really felt old when you just asked that, but yeah, great question though. I mean, you can't assume everybody knows that. So
yeah, and I'd rather just explain what it is instead of like when I was listening to him, like, what does that mean? So that's good. But yeah, that makes sense.
Yeah. Well, anyways, guys, thanks for joining us on the podcast today, and here is episode with Steve Lutz on college ministry in a post-Christian culture.
You're listening to the Roundup Podcast, a podcast on reaching the college campus, developing leaders, and sending out kingdom multipliers. This podcast is created by the Southern Baptists of Texas Convention and provided through cooperative program giving.
Well, hey, Steve, how's it going?
Good, Mitch. Good to see you. Good to talk to you.
Yeah, you too, man. Glad to have you on the podcast. I have my co-host with me, Kylie Badgley, today. How are you, Kylie?
I'm good. How are you? How are you, Steve?
Hi, Kylie. Good to see you.
Well, hey, we asked Steve, we wanted you to come on because there is a book that has been incredibly influential, not only to me, but our college leaders across the state of Texas. It's a book that you wrote almost 9 years ago, College Ministry in a Post-Christian Culture. And yes. I always say that I would love to write a book on college ministry in the way that I think it ought to be done. But the problem is the book is already written, and this is the book. So
that's very kind of you.
Yeah. So I always give out, when there's new college leaders, I give them College Ministry in a Post-Christian Culture and the Master Plan of Evangelism. And those are like the two things I said, hey, if you want to make disciples, thinking about it in a college context, here's your package. So
I'm a huge fan of master plan, so it's an honor to be included in that category. Yeah, it's always encouraging for me and humbling to hear like how it gets used and who's using it, because I'm like, so many of these folks have gone way beyond anything I've done, and it's just like, it's awesome to see it being used and helping people around the country and even beyond that. So glad to hear that.
Yeah, for sure, man. Well, we love you, man. We appreciate your work. Even I remember when I had first come on staff here at the Southern Baptist of Texas Convention, February of 2016, I had an event that was already on the calendar for May, and I didn't even really know where to start, where to go. And they said, hey, you got to get Steve in here. So you came in and you invested in about 25 of us, and I think was really a tone setter for the rest of what we've done, of just thinking about collegiate ministry as a place that, hey, we're not waiting on people to come to us. We're actually going to mobilize our people to reach people in the everyday places and spaces of life, and actually quit. You make the argument here. We'll get into some in just a minute, but a lot of our ministries are trying to reach the same piece of pie that everybody else is. Right. And when we mobilize people to be who they're made to be in the everyday places of life, we actually reach more people. So.
Yep, that's the idea.
I'm jabbering here, but let's get to you, my man. So tell us a little bit about yourself, man. What's kind of your story? How'd you get to where you're at today?
Yeah. Well, I guess I'd start from a college ministry perspective. It was my own experience as an undergrad at Penn State, where I was part of a collegiate church, and we were meeting on campus. We had hundreds of kids coming. I was a worship leader and an elder.
Whoa, you're a worship leader?
Yeah, and so that really gave me a vision for ministry. Yeah, 21-year-old elder. That was interesting.
Were you Mormon at the time, or what?
What's that?
Were you a Mormon at the time, or what?
Yeah, it was great because it allowed us to cut our teeth in ministry, and we had real decision-making authority, and there was oversight from like real actual adults, which was good, but that gave so many of us a vision for ministry, and crucially, it gave me a deep conviction that we typically undersell what college students are capable of, and that a lot of times they will rise to the bar that we set for them. And if we assume that all they want to do is play Chubby Bunny with marshmallows and do root beer keg stands and other kind of silly Christianized versions of college silliness, then that's the bar that they'll rise to. But if we give them a kingdom vision, they'll rise to that. And so that was profound. So I went to seminary after that, and my wife and I got married right out of college, and then I was part of a church plant right out of seminary in Philadelphia, and that's where I cut my teeth in college ministry from a leadership perspective, leading a ministry at Temple University right in Philadelphia. And that was like early 2000s, so 2003 to 07. And that's where a lot of my convictions about college ministry in particular began to get worked out. And because we're in the Northeast, it was a very unchurched campus, unreached campus. And we had to think about things in maybe a different way than the typical grid. A lot of the big campus ministries had tried to come into that place and really not seen much fruit or success. And so we had an opportunity to start with a blank sheet of paper and saw some really good fruit come from that. And became, that ministry grew to be like the biggest student org at Temple University and the biggest Christian organization for students in the city of Philadelphia, which is a huge college town. And that was a tremendous learning experience for me. I look back, I'm like, I knew so little, and those people were so gracious to me. And it was crucially, that ministry was embedded in a local church and actually a church plant. And so that feature of it, of being deeply connected to a church, which at that time, a lot of people were skeptical of, it's like, well, how do you, college students, they come and go. Actually, at that church plant, we loved them. We needed them. We valued them. A lot of them are still part of that church 15 years later or whatever it is, as elders and pastors and deacons and worship leaders and all that kind of stuff, because they stayed in the city. They caught the vision for it. So that in many ways, that church grew around the college ministry, which was awesome. And then I moved back to my alma mater, with my family in 2008 and was part of various ministries here and quickly became connected to a church, Calvary Church here, and been part of ministry in a variety of spheres. And now that's when the book came out in 2000. I guess I wrote it in 2010 and then came out in 2011. And that just opened up all kinds of doors to be speaking and, coming to hang out with groups like yours that we did back then. And did you say 2012 that was, or?
No, that was 2016 is when we had
2016. Yeah. So I really enjoyed the opportunity to get to know people in ministry in all kinds of contexts around the world, and even started like consulting with people in college ministry in other parts of the world, like South Africa and Australia and Europe. And it was amazing because they were finding a lot of the things that they were facing were not that different from what we're facing in North America. In fact, they're often like a click or two ahead of us. But they were finding what I wrote in my books helpful. And so really have appreciated the perspective that I've been able to get over the past several years, talking to leaders like yourself in all kinds of contexts.
So, Steve, what was kind of, by the way, you do mention the book, and you said that Philadelphia is a college town. You said there's like 80, did you say 80 something universities or colleges within Philly? Yeah.
And like at that point, over 300,000 college students.
Wow.
Pretty big number. And yeah, the metro area has like over 300 colleges and universities.
Man.
So
wow.
Big mecca for that kind of stuff.
God, goodness, I didn't even realize that. Well, man, I would love to kind of get to the root of all this, and you've already kind of gotten to it a little bit, but what was the reason that you thought, hey, I need to write a book on college ministry in a post-Christian culture? Obviously, I'm sure there was a moment or moments you had that says, hey, we got to do this college ministry differently than we've been doing it.
Yeah, I think there was a lot going on there in the early 2000s about how are we going to do ministry and reach this next generation. Mm-hmm. And really the book came out of me reading a lot of other books, trying to figure that out myself. And I kept waiting for someone to write it.
Yeah.
Who's going to do this? And I remember one of the pivotal books for me was, and there was a lot of good ones. And at that point, a lot of people are getting into Leslie Newbegin. Yeah. And he's talking about, it's not Christendom anymore. And we have to figure out how to reach people in this new context. And I kept waiting. But then I read Al Hirsch's Forgotten Ways. Yeah. And that was a book that really brought like the cultural, philosophical, the theological, and then the practical, how to do it together in a way that very few other books have been able to do. And I thought, man, this is so good for college ministry. And someone's got to take this and translate it to what we're trying to do. And I kept waiting for somebody to write that, and they never did. So I said, fine, screw it, I'll just write it myself. Yeah. So that's what I did. That was my very self-conscious attempt to take stuff in the Forgotten Ways and resources like that, and then translate it to the practice of campus ministry. And it was great because one of the first people to endorse it was Alan Hirsch, which meant a ton to me. And so that was what drove me to it. But I think if I can zoom out a little bit, I'm sort of a historian at heart, Mitch. So forgive me for if this goes a little too far afield. But in the early 2000s, there's all this stuff in the air. And at that point, the seeker-sensitive movement had been dominant for 20, 25 years at that point. Mm-hmm. And I'm not here to throw stones at it because I think it did a lot of good, right? Some of those leading churches, Saddleback and Willow, taught us a ton about engaging our contexts. But those were primarily like, what can we do to draw people back into the church? Those who have left, maybe have some religious impulse, and they have kids and they want their kids to grow up in church, but not the church that they grew up in. So how do we get them back? How do we package this to draw people back in? And there was early 2000s. At that point, we're in the throes of Gen X, and how are we going to reach Gen X? And so there was this in the ferment of that time. There was a lot of questions about how are we going to reach them? And so what you saw was people coming out and they're asking all kinds of questions like, well, how do we do church now? And I would put them in kind of three categories. There were, I would call them the reformists, who said theology is good, the gospel is good, but we need to change what we're doing to get back to it. And so you saw people saying, listen, enough of the more shallow messages. We got to preach. We're going to preach for an hour, and we're going to preach deep theology, and it's going to reach people, right? And there are great examples of that. And then we had other people saying, I think the issue is structure and how we do church. And we need to get back to like house churches. And if you look around the world, you see where the church is thriving, it's often in these smaller groups and small groups, house churches. And we need to do more of that here. Organic church, right, was another term thrown around. And then there was a third group of, I'll call them revisionists. And they were saying, hey, maybe this whole, people don't seem as interested in church. Maybe we're doing it wrong. And you got a lot of the did God really say kinds of questions. And you got some people saying, listen, I'm just asking questions, but is the Bible really God's word? And, that became what, pretty soon we were having like emergent conversations. And so all that stuff was kind of in the early to mid 2000s was in this ferment together. And it was hard to tease out and parse out what was what. And some of that led in some very unhealthy directions, I would say. Some of it led to some very good things in how we do church. But all of it was asking for this generation, what became, millennials, how do we reach them where they're at and remain faithful to the gospel? And so it was kind of a long roundabout way of answering your question, like where was this coming from? Why did I write this book? We're trying to make sense of how to bring a timeless gospel to an ever-changing context.
Yeah, man, it's good stuff. I love you. You definitely think big picture and silo it all down. I love that. That's how I think. So good stuff. Yeah. Well, hey, in the, one of the things you start out at the beginning of your book is, before we get even into more of the big picture of things, is you say, you have a quote that says, the best thing you can do for your ministry is to start with yourself and get grounded in the gospel. I have found that to a very fundamental idea, very fundamental, statement, but I've often found that as working with churches, oftentimes we start externally before we actually start internally. And I just love to get your how did you get to the place of realizing that yourself and maybe even with some of the leaders around you?
Yeah, I think, gosh, I'm glad I wrote that. I would say it's even more true now. Like the older I get, the more true I understand that to be.
Yeah.
The scary thing, and especially if you have some listeners here who are earlier on in their ministry.
Yeah.
I think one of the most scary, humbling, sobering things about ministry is that you tend to amplify and replicate who you are, better or for worse.
Yep.
And especially when you're working with people in a highly formative stage, which is college ministry, it becomes even more imperative that who you are, what you're seeking to replicate to others is based on the gospel. Mm-hmm. Because if not, what are you replicating? What are you creating? Mm-hmm. I think we can look back and see places where people started off well, and then it didn't go, and then they didn't finish well. Mm-hmm. And a lot of times it's because skills were outstripping character.
Yeah.
And we've seen that. There's carnage all over. And that's not just them. That's the churches that they led were deeply impacted by that. And that's a scary thing about ministry. So, Jesus, at one point, he's talking about, get the log out of your own eye before you deal with the speck in somebody else's. That is true in personal character. It's also true when you're talking about strategy and you're talking about like, hey, how are we going to change this church or change this ministry? If we just jump, like you're saying, Mitch, to the externals and what other people are doing, without first looking at our own assumptions, our own hearts, our own character, we're going to tend to have blind spots that amplify things that we should not be amplifying.
Mm-hmm.
And so that, starting with our identity in Christ, so many young people in ministry are looking to prove something to themselves, to other people, to God. The sooner that you can get out of that performance trap, I mean, it's just a big one I see. I've seen it in my own life. The sooner you can work through that to deal with like just the performance issues, improving yourself, the better. And a lot of times people are drawn to ministry because it's like, well, that's significant. That's world changing. That's eternity shaping. I can do something significant for eternity. Mm-hmm. And, you know, it seems so good on the surface, right? But it can get twisted very quickly in our hearts. Mm-hmm. And so I think that's kind of where that's coming from, and it remains true. That's an evergreen statement.
Yeah. What are some like smaller practical, like where do you start with that? What does that look like when you're like, okay, look at yourself and your character and all of that?
Yeah, that's a great question, Kylie. I think, you know, I think it was Grishel. You're talking about Grishel earlier. I think Grishel, in one of his books, talked about being a functional atheist. Yeah. So one of the things that I think is just a good litmus test is, okay, in my daily life, if we were to roll back the video, are people going to see that there's a dependency on God expressed in prayer? Are they going to see a humility where I'm demonstrating I know I don't have all the answers and I'm seeking wise counsel from others? Are people going to see that I'm not leaning on my own understanding, but trusting in the Lord? So like there's decisions, there's relational context, there's what you're doing in your own prayer closet, that all of these are sort of indicators and litmus tests. And, you know, I realize not many people are going to spend, you know, an hour or 2 hours in prayer every day, but the fundamental arc of your life, does it demonstrate a humility, a dependency, a trusting, a resting? How about overwork, right? People working, you know, the world depends on me. If I stop working for a second, things are going to fall apart. You know, that's one of my questions for people is like, so what's your Sabbath look like? Oh, you know, I just been crazy lately. I don't really have a Sabbath. I'm kind of on all the time. Yeah, I'm a hard worker. Yeah, man, you know, the kingdom of God will go on without you. So it's these little litmus tests that I think become really important for us to look at.
Yeah.
Steve, these two, you say you have two convictions in the book, and I think really these convictions are the book. But the first one is this: college students are the most strategic ministry group in the world today. And the second is that we need to change the way we reach them in order to help them become more missional. What you've already touched on this a little bit, but tell us what led you to these type of convictions.
Yeah, I still believe that today. You know, the way I like to describe it on the strategy thing, and I've written about this a couple places, but you know, it's kind of, college students are the most strategic people group in the world today because of who they are, when they are, and where they are, right? So these are the future leaders of our world. These are people who are going to, because they're privileged enough to get a good education, they're going to be leaders in whatever sphere they end up working in. And so that's tremendously influential. That's strategic. Also, when they are, it's such a highly formative stage of life. People are figuring out, really, what do I want to live for? What do I believe in? What do I want to give my life to? And so if there's 1,000 forces competing for their attention and for them to commit their life to it in the college years, and if we're not part of that conversation, we will miss out on influencing people for their lifetime. It's all about trajectory shaping, right? You know, I use the analogy of a rocket. So you guys know, if they're launching a rocket, if Elon Musk sends up another rocket with SpaceX, and it can just be like a fraction of a degree off early in the launch, and it's not going to hit where it needs to go, right? So in the college years, we're trying to help them get set up for the best launch possible. And a deviation of even a little bit early on can be a massive deviation later in life. So the when is super important. And then the where, I just think a college campus is a magical place. It's a marketplace of ideas. It is upstream from the rest of culture in many ways. And so highly strategic. So, who they are, where they are, when they are, massively important. And I think that, the need to continually change the way we're reaching them, I would say that was true when I wrote it. It continues to be true just because the world around us, it's constantly changing. And if anything, the pace of change has only increased. So we have to be, the reformers talked about semper reformanda, always reforming. And I think that applies. You take a timeless gospel, which does not change, but the way that we are communicating it must constantly be changing to the culture around us. And that's especially true on our campuses.
That's good. I think I first read, and I don't know if it was, I don't know if this idea originates with him. I mean, nothing today's original, but Steve Addison, I think he said, forgot the way he put it, but basically, we have, maybe it was actually Alan Hurst. We have the ancient gospel, but contemporary methods. And, it's just always being willing to be nimble to the changing, of what's happening. Well, hey, that kind of leads us into this question. You also say in there, you say traditional ministry treats mission or outreach as something we do, while missional is something we are. Mission shifts from an activity to our identity. Can you help flesh that out a little bit?
Yeah, that's a classic, missional theology principle. And, that's part of why I gave that context for the, coming out of the seeker-sensitive world. And, those churches were doing and still are doing missions, right? And that's great. But there's this sense of, missions as a program or an activity or something reserved for the select few who feel that special burden.
Yep.
Whereas I think when you read the course of the New Testament and the direction of that, it's really saying there's no one who's exempt from this mission. Jesus says, as the Father has sent me, so I am sending you, John 20:21. And so that's comprehensive. Mission is not meant to simply be a program or an activity. It's comprehensive. It's meant to not just be siloed off as one activity in your life or in the church's life, but it's meant to permeate everything we're doing. We're doing children's ministry with a sense of the mission. We're doing college ministry with a sense of God's mission. We're sending people out to their workplace on Monday morning, and they're on mission, right? They don't have to wait to go on some missions trip to end up on mission. Yeah. And so what that statement there, and what I think missional theology was seeking to do was to stop promoting a truncated view of mission that really reduced it to something very small activity-wise, and broaden it to say, no, this is meant to permeate everything that we do and everything that we're about.
I feel like today there is, missional is something that was very popular. Obviously when you're writing the book, I think at least the language of saying missional is kind of, died down. But
definitely, yeah.
But today what's funny is I feel like that term is outdated for some. Two, it's also seems like a cuss word to some in the church where it's like, hey, don't use that language. We'll do it, but don't use that language of missional. Any thoughts on that?
Can you explain the cuss word?
Yeah, where it's I've run into several churches where they want to posture themselves missionally. As in, mobilizing the body, in the everyday places and spaces of life, but not using the language. I feel like there's maybe even some in the church, and this may be, you're in the Northeast, this may just be a Texas thing, but where it's almost like, hey, it's almost where it's this kind of rebellion against a traditional way or model of ministry or something like that.
I definitely get that. There was like a lot of good things in church sometimes it can end up becoming a fad or sort of get co-opted and in people's minds begin to mean things that maybe it does not mean or wasn't intended to mean.
Yeah.
I definitely think when you go back to that picture I was painting of the early 2000s and that ferment of all those different things going on at that time. And for some people, missional meant bad emergent theology that was questioning basic foundations of the faith, right? I don't think that's what that word meant at the time or is supposed to mean now. But if you have that association, yeah, that's going to sound like a cuss word. So I think the missional thing is a perennial, evergreen theological concept. Statements like, it's not only that the church has a mission, but God's mission has a church, right? There's a lot of wisdom to that. And, these things go in cycles. And every few generations, the church is rediscovering things that she knew but had forgotten. And, the missional thing was just part of that. So I still think it's a very sound concept. And at this point, there's other, like, gospel-centered, right? That's another term that it felt like was really crucial for a while. Then everybody started using it. And it's like, yeah, it has meaning, but I don't even know if it carries the weight that it was for a while. It happens. So whether you use the term or not, I don't really care. I don't tend to use it myself much these days, really. It's present in the book, but the evergreen imperative of we need to raise up and make disciples of people who see it as part of their calling to follow Jesus in whatever sphere of life, whatever area of life, and see everything as kingdom work, right? And every believer is called to join Jesus in this kingdom work. That's the truth that I hope keeps getting communicated and lived out.
Yeah. Can you talk a little bit more about what you said earlier? College students will rise to the bar that you set for them, because I know college is just it's a confusing time. So what did that look like for you to empower students? Like, you can live missionally even when you don't even know like what you're going to be doing after college, or you might not even have your major figured out. So I know those are some things in college going through my mind. Is like, oh, I can't lead people. I don't even know what I'm doing. So
yeah, I think it's one thing is how to, and I'm probably guilty of this, where you paint a really big picture and then people can come away from that like, well, I guess I got to boil the ocean, I got to reach the whole world for Jesus, and I got to do the seemingly impossible task, and I have no clue where to start. And I think this would come out more in a smaller group or a one-on-one setting, but it's like, okay, so let's talk about, if I'm talking with a student, let's talk about your life. Let's talk about your roommates, right? Let's start. For a lot of college students, the biggest kingdom frontier where they need to seek to follow Jesus in that is their relationship with their roommate. And so, okay, so you're not getting along. Let's talk about loving your enemies, right? Let's talk about forgiving others as Christ has forgiven you. Let's talk about the wisdom of overlooking an offense, as Proverbs says is a glorious thing, right? Let's talk about what it means to be a faithful witness in your classroom, to your advisor, on your team that you're working with, in your workplace, and really just helping them, okay, let's start working out what it means to be on mission in the places where God has you right now. And so in that sense, the whole imparting that to students was not so much of a content thing, but it was a learning by doing thing, which I think is absolutely key, especially for the generations that we're dealing with now. Content is free. It's all over the place. Content's cheap. Yeah. And with older generations, content was it, right? You gave people more than a carpenter, and you told them to read it, and they'd be like, boom, I'm changed, right? And now the content's everywhere, and it is much more about the doing it and the living it out and the learning by doing, which I think is actually a very healthy thing. Right? And so that's where I think it has to start. If you're working with students, let's just talk about the daily nitty-gritty of how they're living their lives. And then you hope that's part of that trajectory shaping, putting them on an arc of continuing to follow Jesus wherever they go post-college.
Man, that last 2 minutes there makes this whole podcast, man. That was really good. Content is cheap. The life on life, man, that is the priceless, man, learning by doing. I think about, me and my wife, we get to serve at a church in downtown Fort Worth that ministers to TCU students. We have thoroughly enjoyed it. And we, realizing that, and not all of them, some folks come from great families with godly parents. But for a lot of these students, we are the godliest people they know. We are the standard. And so by their, so we're kind of setting that bar, that expectation of them. I mean, I remember when I was a 23-year-old young man, I came to faith in Christ, and just kind of around that college age, I had a pastor in my life that he was the bar, and that was what I aspired to. When I thought of a Christian man, I thought that's what a Christian man looks like. And so it was this, and I learned by watching him, even in the simplest things of life, from the way he treated his wife and his kids and all those kind of things. And so, man, that was really, really good.
Yeah.
Well, let me jump into this next question. This kind of goes along with that, but you said that in disciple making, we've compartmentalized the learning from the being and doing. We've implicitly told students they can't do until they've learned enough. And I think that kind of fits in with that of this, and we even talked about it before we got on the podcast, this understanding of disciple making is taking in the content, taking in the information or the knowledge versus this kind of obedience base of actually walking it out. Can you flesh that out? I mean, you've already done that a little bit, but any more thoughts on that?
I think one of the things that we've been waking up to in the church is this idea that, man, stuffing people's heads full of content is not transformation. And because we've tried that. Yeah. And we got people with big heads and full heads who are not transformed, who are not different. Yeah. Like the last thing I want, and I'm sure people listening to this, the last thing you want in your ministry is a bunch of big-headed but arrogant, un-Christ-like people who are going and pounding people over the head with how much they should follow Jesus, right? Yeah. So we've been making that mistake for a while in the church, and there's all kinds of reasons for that I won't get into here, but a far better learning technique is to give people, content on a more of a daily as needed basis, and then do something with it right away. Mm-hmm. Well, one, because we tend to internalize it much better if we act on it immediately. Yeah. And we tend to actually believe it, and it goes from just kind of living up in the head to dwelling in the heart. Yeah. And so giving people a lot more bite-sized assignments and saying, no, go do that. And I have friends who even be like, they're discipling somebody and it's like, here's your assignment. Don't come back next week unless you've done it. Oh, yeah. And I think there's a lot of wisdom to that. Yeah. And I think Jesus was constantly, man, those guys are following him. They're not even really sure who he is. And this is stuff that's in Master Plan, by the way. This is not new. But they're not even sure who he is. And Jesus is giving them kingdom assignments. Mm. And they are learning as they go, even when they're not sure on this basic question of who exactly he is. And so that whole line, even between evangelism and discipleship, starts to get blurred in some healthy ways. And, so content is super valuable. I wouldn't have written books if I didn't think content was important. But books divorced from putting it into practice can actually be deadly. Mm-hmm. It can be really dangerous to the soul. And so, there's orthodoxy and there's also orthopraxy. Yeah. We want to be people who are discipling those under our care to not just know stuff, but to do stuff in a Christ-like way, to put it really kind of bluntly. Yeah. And I think for many of us, we've been raised in a know stuff kind of culture. And so it's a big paradigm shift for us to shift. But it's what I'm seeing is that these younger generations are really hungry for that because they've been getting all the content and they want to see someone live it. Like you're talking about that pastor who mentored you. Like, just show me how it works, man. Like, how do I be a husband and father? How do I balance ministry and like being a neighbor in my neighborhood, right? You were already maybe even unconsciously looking for that at first, and then you realized, man, he's actually given me a lot more than I realized, and that's how I think this is meant to work.
Yeah. What's funny is even during that time, I think of just my understanding of disciple making, I didn't even realize that him inviting me into his life and living together was actually disciple making.
Yeah.
I think I would thinking, no, hey, we're not sitting at a table doing a Lifeway study. That's disciple making. This is just us hanging out, Right. And so there was a big paradigm shift later on. I'm like, oh, it's all, it all is disciple making.
So on a practical level,
yeah,
and I'm sure, listeners of this have run into this. Sometimes where we have to start is to deprogram people's assumptions. Because they'll say, would you disciple me? And they think, okay, so what's the weekly Bible study and what do I have to read?
Yeah.
And you may incorporate that. I hope you do, right? Mm-hmm. But it needs to be a lot more than that. And some weeks you might not talk about the reading at all. You might just be talking about some life on life thing. Yeah. And so a lot of times we got to shape those expectations and reset them and mess with people a little bit in terms of what they think discipleship is. And maybe not even explain the whole thing because they're not ready for that, but just saying, this is how I am discipling you, and it'll make sense.
Okay, so I'd love to know your thoughts on this, because I've seen where people have this idea of like, okay, I don't need to stuff them with content. They say, I don't want them to have a consumeristic mindset. I want them to be missional. But then they thrust them into leading more of a community group. And I'd just love to know your thoughts. Is that what you see or mean when you talk about this stuff in your book? Because to me, I'm newer to just ministry and leadership, I guess, and I'm like, whoa, they're new. I don't know if they should be leading, and so I'd love to know your thoughts on that.
That is such a good question, because sometimes people can, the whole like, the way you learn to swim is I'm going to throw you in the deep end, right? And sometimes that can just even be a leader's justification for not being a good leader, and kind of being lazy and not wanting to walk through all the steps it takes to develop somebody. We were talking earlier, Mitch, about, green. And I think that leadership square is such a useful tool. Mm-hmm. And it's the whole, and I'm sure people have come across this, but it's the whole, like, I do, you watch, and then, we do together, and then you do, and I watch, and now you're passing on to somebody else. And consciously locating where the person that you're seeking to disciple is at in that process, and meeting them where they are, I think is key. Mm-hmm. And so if you're like a brand new believer and you don't know, your rear end from the sky, and I'm asking you to lead something, that's not really caring for you. That's not really discipleship. That's kind of a ministry malpractice thing. Yeah. So, knowing where they are and giving them what they need in that situation, I think is really key. And then crucially, when they have these experiences, making sure that you debrief them and help them take away lessons from that. And this is not something that happens. This is not microwaved. This is a slow cooker.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, that's good. That's good.
Steve, at the end of your book, you got this line, and you say, campus ministry is uniquely positioned to shape the future because we work with those who are the future. What do you think is the long-term, when you think about doing college ministry, what is that long-term effect? How does that affect the church? And obviously, that you believe that. So what does that look like? How does that play out for a church?
Yeah, man, you see it really in all kinds of spheres, not just the church, but any organization that ignores recruiting and development of the young will eventually become an old and dying and irrelevant organization. And so, I don't hear this as much as I used to. But I used to hear a lot of college students, that's a waste of time. They're here and then they're gone, and they're not even here that much when they are here, and they don't give anything, and they just take up seats, right? I used to hear that. Yeah. Maybe some of our listeners here still hear that. I think there's more of a waking up to saying, man, if we don't reach the upcoming generations today, we're not going to have a church tomorrow or in another generation. And so that's kind of the negative. Let me frame it positively.
Yeah.
Positively is college students are the future. This is a generation that is crying out. I mean, we see it in the workplace, right? They're not motivated by money. They're motivated by other things. They're motivated by experiences. They're motivated by having a purpose bigger than themselves. Man, the church, no one has better purpose and significance than we do, right? We should be all over that. We should be able to speak to that directly. You want to give your life to something with a greater meaning, and we've got that better than anybody. And so I just see tremendous opportunity, and I think smart churches out there, smart ministries are cognizant of that and seek to make the most of that. And we reach this generation, and they're going to be around for a while, and they're going to reach a bunch more generations. So, let's go for it.
Yeah, I read it's been a couple of years now, but one of Barna's studies, and they talked about how strictly formal ministry, church leadership speaking, that the average age of a pastor in the last 20 years has gone up by 10 years, and there's far less leadership being raised up within the church. And I think a quick fix of that is reach students at their most a place where they're most open, which is the campus. They're launching into adulthood. Like, it's just such an easy, quick turnaround. But we have to, again, like you said, we have to get rid of these barriers of students cost too much, they don't give back, and all that those kind of things are really barriers to us kind of changing that. So totally on board with that. Well, so this book now was written in 2011, so it's almost a decade old, which I'm sure is probably pretty wild for you to think about.
Yeah, it is. I never expected it, and I still even get like royalty checks and stuff, which just blows my mind. And it's crazy that people are still reading it and finding it helpful. I'm glad that it's had a decent shelf life, and it is not like, oh, that was so 2010, and so dated. So there's definitely some things I would probably do differently if I rewrote that today. I'd have to talk to my publisher if they want to do a second edition.
Well, hey, let's talk about that. I'd love to know, what are the things that you would do differently in that?
One thing that instantly comes to mind. Well, one is I think I would nuance the whole missional conversation and language in there. Yeah. Just knowing how much that conversation has changed in the last decade. Yeah. I would probably do less around that term, although the concepts would remain there.
Yep.
A second thing that was just beginning, but is much more dominant now, is how everything is mediated by technology. Mm-hmm. So, the iPhone came out in 2007. Facebook is just on the rise. At the point that I'm writing that, it's not, social media and all the various platforms that people are on now was not as dominant. People were not married to their smartphones the way they are now when I wrote that book. And so, essentially technology went from being an app in our life to being the operating system. For many, everything we do is mediated through technology. And we're seeing the fruit of that all over the place, including our politics and everything else. And so that's an inescapable dominant feature of culture and how we do ministry. And I think we're only at the beginning of realizing some of the pitfalls of that, and also some of the opportunities. And, college ministry being upstream. This is where college ministry has great value to the rest of the church if people have eyes to see it. Because I've often said, man, college ministry is a great laboratory to figure stuff out and to try things and see if they work.
Yeah.
And the great thing is that, like, if you mess it up, don't worry, those kids will graduate in a couple years. You can start all over again. But college is a place where the church should be trying different things to say, does this work? Does this meet people where they're at? Is this breaking through? And technology is a big part of that. I'd probably want to explore more like who is seeing fruit and success in that.
Well, hey, I tell you what, if you want to write that book, I'd be happy to co-author it with you and we could write it together. I would love that. Because, hey, if it's been almost 10 years, man, we got to write. And here's the problem now is you probably write that book and in 2 years you'd have to write another book the way that everything is changing so rapidly.
It's relentless, right? I mean, how do we keep our head on our shoulders with the pace of change? But we'll just do our best.
Yeah.
I'd want to know just briefly what made you just passionate enough to like lead in college ministry and then even go as far to write a book. I know there are things, but just did you have an experience in college or something or a person in your life that really affected you and made you maybe think, oh, I want someone else to have this?
Yeah. I think there's a few things. I mean, I grew up in a ministry home. My parents both in ministry, my dad a pastor. And I remember going with my dad for him when he was speaking to college groups, even as a high schooler. I would like trail along with them. And so just seeing that even as a high schooler, and then my own college pastor was very influential, just a guy that loved Jesus big time and imparted that to us. And in that season, my faith became more experiential. One experience, and I believe I talk about this in the book, Kylie, is I remember, I was hanging out with this church plant in Philadelphia, and it wasn't yet clear what my role would be with them. And I wasn't coming out of seminary saying, I want to do college ministry. It was more like, I just want to be on the cutting edge of something. I want to be breaking some new kingdom ground. And I remember going with one of the other planting pastors, and he was speaking to this group of 40 college students at Temple. And they had no leadership. And they were completely, self-organized and holding on themselves. And I remember I was just going to attend and see what was happening. I remember the worship was really moving. It was really moving to me, these students who were making it happen on their own. And I sat next to one of the leaders in that group. And I remember this. She turned to me and she said, we've been praying for years for someone to lead us and teach us and disciple us. And I'm praying that person is you.
Oh, wow.
And I was like, whoa. And it just kind of hit me between the eyes. And to this day, I'm going to say that was my Macedonian call to come to this group and lead it. And that was the next, 4 or 5 years of my life, and saw some great things happen there. And I think that just comes from being in a place of saying, Lord, where you lead me, I'm going to follow. And I know many of the people listening to this have probably had some similar situations, maybe not, hit you over the head. I probably was thick-headed enough. I needed someone to hit me over the head like that. But, you look back and you see conversations and people. And when we're saying, God, I'll follow you where you lead, it's amazing how he answers that.
Oh, man, so good. So, Steve, what do you tell the young college leader, college pastor today that's, maybe a year or two into the work? What's some dumb tacks you can pay for them as they're kind of getting started?
Oh, yeah. Gosh, man, a lot of dumb tacks I've paid. If that could go to my account, I'd be a rich man. I would say that, man, please don't. There's a tendency in college ministry where the relentless pace of those 15, 16 weeks of the semester, where you kind of it's like head down, head down, head down. Then you come up for breath, and then it's head down again. And it can be all consuming. And so there's a tendency in that to focus so much on what's happening in your ministry right now and keeping that machine going. So the thing that I would plead with people is don't lose sight of the big picture. And the trajectory that you're shaping people for is not graduation. it's a lifetime of faithfulness.
Mm.
And so, I play around. There's a term I play around with called, it's lifetime, but also life-wide. So preparing them to live out their faith in every aspect of their lives. We didn't bring it up, but my second book, King of the Campus, was really written to address that. And that one is written to students. It's a good text for discipleship, but it deals with all these different spheres of students' lives. And so, lifelong trajectory and life-wide faithfulness are two things. And key to that, this is another thing that I would hit on, if I'm standing on my soapbox, is give them a vision for the local church. Because a lot of times, let's face it, a college ministry fellowship group is kind of an artificial ecosystem. People are super available. Everything is tailored right to them, 18 to 22. And then we've seen it happen many times. Students are used to that rich fellowship that's uniquely possible in a collegiate environment when they don't feel like they have a lot of time, but they do have a lot of time. So they graduate and they get a job and they have more responsibilities of quote, real life. And they look for the fellowship that they had in college and they have a hard time finding it. And so giving them a vision for the local church and even maybe scaling back some of the demands and the asks that I'm putting on them during their undergrad years in order for them to become meaningfully connected to a local church, that's actually going to be better discipleship for the long haul. And that's hard because that feels like a sacrifice on our end, but I'd argue it's what the church needs us to be doing as people on the front line.
Man,
yeah, I think that's good. I've seen that with so many girls that because I'm like 2 years out of college and they're like, I don't have any community. It's just so different than college. And they keep jumping around churches because they're trying to find the same exact thing that they have in collge. And we're just that's really good.
Yeah. And there's an adjustment there. And I remember that adjustment myself. But helping people see no, there's wonderful people here. There's real faith being worked out. It's just going to look a little different and the pace is probably going to be a little different. But hang in there and you'll find it. And so we can have those conversations with them in real time if we're helping them, develop the understanding of that during their undergrad years.
Yeah, that's great stuff. Hey, Steve, tell us a little bit about what kind of work you're doing now. You've kind of shifted in some of the things you've been doing in the past as a pastor, college pastor, and doing some marketplace stuff. Tell us, kind of give us an update, man.
Yeah. I view it as, my ministry has shifted contexts. Mm-hmm. So still very much care about ministry and ministry to next generation. But for a variety of reasons, I've moved into kind of more of a marketplace role as a consultant now. Mm-hmm. And I would say, I view it as bivocational, or, as my friend Brad Briscoe would say, co-vocational.
Yeah.
Which is a term I like because it underscores, hey, every calling is a kingdom calling. Yeah. And it's worthy of that. And it's not like ministry's up here as the super spiritual one and then everybody else is second class. Mm-hmm. So I've been preaching that for years and now I'm actually living it. So a couple of things that I'm doing right now is working with organizations, churches, and business organizations on how to understand and develop their people. Mm-hmm. And so, we call it talent optimization, but in many ways I feel like this is just kind of a business application of stuff I've been doing for many years already, and it comes from a place of how do we serve the people that have been entrusted to us? How do we develop them? And how do we work together as a team, respecting gifts, respecting strengths, respecting different aspects of, I would say, how God has made them. And so I feel like I'm able to bring a lot of good gospel truth into these organizations I'm working with. So I'm pretty excited about that. And so my consulting firm is 12 Rock Associates, 12rock.com. And the 12 Rock comes from Joshua 4. And it's when the Israelites are coming out of the wilderness and they're looking back at 40 years and how God has brought them through that. And then each tribe takes a rock and they set it up in the Jordan River. And so it's kind of like looking back at God's faithfulness, but also looking ahead to the possibility of the promised land. And so I felt like, the looking back, looking ahead, really speaking to kind of where I'm at in my life and also what I hope to do for some of my clients. And if I can just say one other thing, we talked about, the need for people to act on what they're learning.
Mm-hmm.
So, how crucial that is to discipleship.
Mm-hmm.
So one of the things I'm working on right now is software that helps churches or ministries follow up in a timely way with their people, and using actually texting and some web-based stuff to give timely, applications, follow-up. So, you hear the sermon on Sunday and then you get a text on Monday and it's giving you some kind of a follow-up to that. And then there's even like this really rich dialogue that you can have with coaches or mentors. And so I was actually just presenting this to a church I'm working with yesterday, and very enthusiastic response. And so we're sort of beta testing it right now. But, what I see out there is that a lot of times the learning management software that churches are using tends to be one way, and it's the content dump. And it's very much of a discipleship by content. And we're trying to do a whole, I would say this is not a learning management system. This is an action management system. That's what we're building. And I'm very excited to kind of work out some of the kinks and then begin rolling that out to churches and ministries that want to talk about reaching digital natives and, people texting about what are they going to do to take that next step following Jesus today. I think that's going to meet people where they're at and hopefully be a service to a lot of different churches and ministries.
Yeah,
Man.
that sounds so exciting, because it's just you just go to church and you're like, wow, that message was so good. But then like Monday hits and you're like, oh, I'm so stressed. And like, you just forget about it.
Lunch after church hits, right? And you're like, that was good. That was good today. I wonder what it was about, because I already forget.
Yeah.
So I've been there. Any way that we can help our people track with what God's been doing in them, the better. So want to keep putting tools in people's hands. So I'm excited about that.
That's awesome. All right, last question for you, Steve. What is going to be the 2020-2021 Philadelphia Eagles record at the end of the season?
Better than the Cowboys.
Hey, I'm not going to argue with you. I don't know, man.
We got our coach and we got a franchise quarterback, and both of these are kind of question marks with the Cowboys right now. So,
yeah.
We will see. But they got a lot of holes to fill. They got a lot of things they got to address coming up in the draft and free agency. And Dallas in many ways has a better roster. They just are chronic underperformers. So
yeah, that's true. So I don't. I'm at the place where I dearly love the Cowboys. I mean, I grew up. My formative years were early '90s. We're winning Super Bowls, and I'm still, and that is still lasting. I'm still living off of that. Although this last year being what it was probably the most excruciating season I've ever experienced. If you're going to lose. You're going to win. Don't do this back and forth each week. I felt like I was in a dating relationship where I never knew where we were at. Defining the relationship was never there. So it was
almost abusive, It was cruel.
It was emotionally abusive.
I almost feel for you there, Mitch. I almost feel for you.
I appreciate that, dude. Oh, man. Well, Steve, thanks for jumping on with us, man. This is great content, and a lot of the stuff that you talk about in your book is so applicable today. And honestly, just I think it's this is a resource we give all of our college leaders, and I think really the big, one of the biggest things you say in there is that, man, the college campuses and the people are the most strategic mission field, in the world. And if we want to reach them, we got to get out of our comfort zone and go do that, and be willing to meet people where they're at. And so I love it, man. Appreciate what you do, man. God's best to this new adventure in life with, consulting with churches and businesses. Man, I'm really looking forward to seeing how all that works out, man. So thanks for being on, bro.
Yeah, thanks.
My pleasure. Thanks, Mitch. Thanks, Kylie. Yeah, really great talking to you, and I love what you guys are doing down there with SBTC, Collegiate, and seeing how God's expanding the kingdom down there. So Thanks for having me on. Let's do it again sometime.
Yes, sir. Thanks, Steve. See you, man. That was great stuff with Steve. I appreciated him getting on with this. Again, this book greatly shaped me and a lot of Steve's thoughts that obviously been handed down from generation to generation. But, the one-liner that he says in there that really captivates me and is really the why behind what I do is the college campus is the most strategic mission field. And if we believe that is so, that we need to mobilize our people to be missional, to evangelize, to do all those things in every pocket of the campus. And if we're waiting for people to come to us, we're going to miss out on so many students and really impacting the future.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I really loved it too, because I think after a while of just hearing the same language and people keep telling you, be missional, like reach people, it can kind of get overwhelming, and then you think like, oh, is this even realistic? Mm-hmm. So whenever he brought it back down to what that looked like and talking about the college student, like their roommate and, mm-hmm. Their classmates, their people that they work with, that just made it kind of, I didn't feel
real,
realistic and like, okay, like this is mm-hmm. possible. This isn't just some church lingo thing that you can't actually do. So
yeah, that's good. Well, guys, thanks for being on the podcast today. If you got some time, we'd love for you to rate and review the podcast and follow us on our social media platforms at SBTC Collegiate. We're on Facebook, Twitter, and Instagram. And we'd love for you to join our network, the Roundup Network. The first step to that is jump onto Facebook, search Roundup Network, ask to join, and we'll get you in that. You will be just thrown into a network of almost 200 leaders from across the state and even the nation. So we do that. But thanks for jumping on today, and we'll see you next time.